I'm Jennifer Gilmour and I'm an author and advocate for women in abusive relationships. I want to get to the answers to the questions that many have from those that work in the domestic abuse sector, getting an inside feel of what it's really like in their job role and sharing it with all of you. Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Abuse Talk interviews, and I'm delighted today to have Karen Evans with me. So thank you, Karen, because this has been a bit of a long time in the making. We had somebody come onto the podcast and request that we covered what we're about to cover. So I've got a bunch of questions and I'm really looking forward to talking to Karen about her job role. Before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to Rockpool. They're the main sponsors for #AbuseTalk, and they deliver training across the UK that support people that are being affected by trauma. And we also need to say thank you to the patrons that are on my Abuse Talk tier, which is kind of new. And they're Katrina Hayes, Susan Rahima and Dion Marsden, and they support me. And you can find out about the Patreon you go onto Patreon and look Jen L. Gilmour up and you can find out the #AbuseTalk tier. We're planning on doing in the future some voting powers on there, theme suggestions, but people get an inside feel for what happens with everything at Abuse Talk headquarters. That's what I'm going to call it now that we've got a website. And it's just a great opportunity to have that further discussion as well. So thank you to everyone there. So I want to say that I was actually connected to Karen through a mutual friend when I basically asked her, as the only person that I would possibly know that would be able to answer my question, when somebody came onto the podcast and asked if we could talk about, women in barracks and the support that they would get as in that kind of situation. And it's definitely something that I hadn't really considered and really difficult to relate to and probably don't know much about in that kind of setting. So I'm really delighted that Karen's going to be going through the questions with me and talking to us about that today. So Karen, welcome. Thank you for joining me at last.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
No problem. First of all, could you just tell everyone a bit about you and your job role so everybody gets a feel for what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I've been chairing the Domestic Abuse Forum in our area for the past 15 years and really kind of seen quite a change during that time. So 15 years ago, really, domestic abuse was quite a newly discussed issue. There was a lot of kind of work around sort of getting people to understand what domestic abuse was. A lot of the time it was kind of thought about as physical abuse, and sort of gradually over the years things have really, really changed. The point now that we've even got laws about coercive control. So like a massive change during that time. So my role really is to kind of bring together all the organisations. The councils and the police at that time recognised that there was quite a gap in terms of bringing the agencies together. So lots of people were recognising there was a problem with domestic abuse. There was a need for people to work together, but it was putting in place that mechanism. How could we do that? How could we bring everyone together? So really kind of starting from that point, started with a few organisations, mainly sort of key statutory organisations, also like victim support, really involved at that time. And then over time sort of gradually evolved. So the forum's got much, much larger. We've got specialist domestic abuse services now, but we've also got a lot of voluntary services. We've got a lot of statutory agencies, everyone kind of working together to try and support people. So the area that I'm based is very near to a military town. So we've got a high percentage, probably about 10% of the population in our local area is military. We've got both Army and we've got RAF bases as well locally, and really we kind of felt that there was a need to kind of all come together, and we formed a smaller subgroup that we could really focus on armed forces issues. So thinking about actually, the support was there within the military, support was there outside the military, but how did we get everyone sort of working together? How did we end up that, really people living in these situations, they could access civilian support if they wanted military support, and how could we all kind of work together? how could we learn from each other? Good practice in both the military and civilian, how could we bring that together? So really kind of quite a journey in terms of our understanding. Also, when we first formed our group, it was like really quite new, so there wasn't a huge amount of joint work in between the military and civilian around domestic abuse. So quite lucky, really. We got in quite an early stage, and as a result of that, I've been on quite a really, really good journey in terms of helping to develop both national and local practice.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's something that I hadn't even thought about too much, and hearing, that you've made those connections and have that ability to, provide that kind of support in a collective way is obviously an important part of, what needs to be done in general. So, if we can talk a bit more about support for, a woman that would be living in the barracks, what kind of support is there?
So within the barracks, there's a huge amount of support. You've obviously got garrison headquarters, so you've got that kind of chain of command. You've got unit welfare officers that they support the families, and also we've got specialist support services, so Army Welfare Service. We've got SAFA that covers the RAF, and we've also got Naval Service Family and People Support that deliver independent support for families. So it's really up to each individual as to what sort of support they feel most confident in accessing. Mm-hmm. So for some people, it might be that they don't want to go anywhere near the chain of command because they're worried about perhaps implications on the serving person's career. They're worried about, what will happen if they say something. So they might, for example, feel better accessing civilian support, which is absolutely fine. They can do that. But if they feel confident enough, then ideally, if they can access one of these independent specialist support services, they have the military background, so they're able to help them both in terms of domestic abuse support, but also knowing what's possible within that military context as well. What's the reality, what happened if they actually come forward and ask for help. Obviously, as I said, you've also got unit welfare officers, so they're very closely involved with the families, but they are part of the chain of command. So for some people, that's like great, because again, that can be really, really helpful. For other people, they might feel a little bit uncomfortable because it might be people they feel they know almost a bit too well to kind of discuss these issues. So that's sort of wide spectrum, really, depending on what each individual feels is best, best for them.
And so how would they find out about it? Is it a part of, I have no idea on the terminology of anything of this, and I should have probably stated that at the beginning and sort of the protocols on anything, but is it when, we move into the barracks that people find out, or is it, something that you update people with, or, try and get people that awareness raised in that field? So how would that work?
I think it's a combination of all those things, because even in the general population, people who are experiencing domestic abuse obviously often sort of don't recognise that that's what it is. It can be very hidden, and people just think that their relationship is how everyone's relationship is. And actually, until you get to a certain point, often people aren't consciously looking out for that information. So if you read an article about domestic abuse, you might not kind of even think it applies to you at all. So it's quite difficult because although like people, when you move into a barracks, yes, there's a directory of services provided, you've got hive centres are there to help people find out information. It's just that often people wouldn't think to actually look for domestic abuse and actually think about that. So it's covered within training. The garrisons are kind of really conscious of domestic abuse. So it's in that publicity material people get when they move into a barracks. However, as I say, sometimes that might not be the right moment for somebody actually needing that information. So continual awareness raising is really, really important. And just getting people to think about, actually, is your relationship like this? Oh, well, actually, that might not be that healthy. We're here to support you. And that's both sides, really. That's both whether you're a victim or a perpetrator or a child young person living in that household. So it's always quite sort of nuanced. It's always that kind of, people do their very, very best to try and explain, the support is here, this is how you can access it. But often it isn't something that people actually can actually sort of think, yes, that resonates with me, that's what I need to do, that's where I need to look for support.
Yeah, no, well, I think that people can relate to that in a normal setting, or not normal setting, but usual sort of everyday life kind of situation where you have to find the words to explain something rather than using maybe the professional terminology, which gets difficult the further down the line you go in your knowledge and experience, because it's really easy to sort of slip into that, isn't it? So like I say, we've had questions about general support, but we have had questions, and I mean, I'm not sure if you will know, but somebody has asked, what is the difference between the UK and the USA legalities in the military regarding domestic abuse? Would that be something you know about?
So it's again, it's kind of a little bit depending where a person's serving.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, if you're sent abroad, so if you're a UK citizen, you're within the armed forces, your family are then classed as part of the armed forces. So if you're posted to America, you come under service law.
Right.
And you're governed by UK law if it's service. However, obviously that can change. So like say if you're perhaps a UK service person, you go abroad, you meet someone, a USA national,
right.
You have a domestic incident which takes place outside the barracks, then obviously then that's where the US law would come into place.
Right, I see.
And if the US person was the perpetrator or the victim, probably as to which route that went. So everywhere in the world where there are military families, there is support in place through Army Welfare Service, or it might be SAFA, it might be the Naval Service Family Support Service, or it might be whoever, whichever agency they've got. So sometimes in some countries it might be that it's an army base, but then the support is delivered by SAFA social care. But there is always somebody in those countries. And we've got an Armed Forces website. If you just Google Armed Forces Domestic Abuse UK, you come to the mod.gov.uk website. And that's one that our forum has put together. And within that, we've got a section on worldwide support. So wherever you are in the world, you can look at who your support service would be at that point.
Wow, so you're dealing with the whole world now, which I think is impressive, because it's so difficult, isn't it? Especially with, connecting or finding what the current law is, or the changes, or the policies. So that's quite a big job you've got there in putting that together. So thank you for sharing that. Sometimes you just don't know if people are going to know this information and everything, but it sounds like you've got so much knowledge on this, and definitely why I've been connected with you, so thank you. Somebody has asked about the law enforcement and the traditional system of a domestic dispute of people who are married to a veteran, and is there a difference between if that veteran has a disability, or whether they don't have a disability or a mental health problem? Would they be treated any differently?
Right, so if you're a serving person, you come under service law.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're based in the UK, so if like you're serving abroad and you're a service person, if you commit an offence, then the service police deal with that. If you're in the UK and you commit an offence, the service police might respond to that, and they might deal with it depending on the severity, or it might be the civilian police. However, with veterans, when you've left the service, then you totally come under the civilian.
Right.
So if a veteran commits an offence, they're dealt with totally by civilian police. The military wouldn't get involved at all. The only thing is that there is additional support available for veterans. So if, for example, somebody had served in the services, they're a veteran, they commit an offence, we have got additional support in place. So within the police custody centres, within the prisons, there's normally like a veteran support service within that criminal justice system. So somebody who understands the unique experiences someone who has served has gone through, and then they can provide them additional support. So it wouldn't change how someone's dealt with through the legalities of it.
No.
They would still be fully accountable for their actions, as would everybody. But there is additional support, which is over and above what's available to the civilian population, that they can access.
Okay, no, that's great. So going on from that then, would there be any difference if they were, in service then? And with, maybe a mental health problem, would there be a difference in treatment regarding that?
Yeah, so again, like the law side of it, if they commit an offence, that's obviously dealt with as for everybody. But yeah, there's a lot of additional support available within the military. Mm-hmm. So if someone's got a mental health issue within the armed forces, there are there's mental health specialists that are armed forces based and everything. If you're a veteran, you're more looking at combat stress or civilian support service for that mental health. But actually, while you're serving, yes, there's a lot of support. There's rehabilitation support. There's even welfare officers are involved. There's a whole team really around supporting that person get that help they need.
No, that's great. Thank you. So, could you tell us what measures are being taken to ensure all spouses of working personnel know there is support if they experience domestic abuse?
Right. So in terms, this kind of two prongs really. So we've got top down, bottom up sort of thing. So at the top of the armed forces, there's a joint service policy. So JSP, it's JSP 913, and that goes across each of the three services. And it's kind of looking at actually how the Army, Navy, RAF will respond, the Marines, how they will respond to domestic abuse. So what's expected, what commanding officers are expected to do, what support is in place. And anybody within the armed forces can access that document, have a look and see what it's saying. So that's very much the kind of policy side of things. Obviously then that translates then into an action plan which sort of filters down. So each of the armed forces also has their own working group. So the Army has a domestic abuse working group. And again, they look at all those strands. They look at the national policy. They look at what's needed and then how can that translate. So quite often it might be there's a big campaign takes place, or it might be messages go out. So for example, starting from the White Ribbon Day last year, there was a very much a campaign of sort of each day messages going out. So within the armed forces, a lot of the messages go out to the service person. Right. Quite often it isn't to the spouse directly, and it's kind of very much the serving person then communicates that information. In the same way, really, as regardless of who you work for, a normal employer. So they would give the information to the service person, they would share it. So obviously, if you've got an abusive situation, you've got someone who's serving and very controlling, obviously they might not share that information with the other person. But right. So alongside that, you've then got the families federations. So you've got Army's Family Federation, and they've got like somebody who specialises in domestic abuse. And those family federations are very much for that wider family. So for the spouse, the other family members, so they can access that information. There's information on their website, but also you can contact them. They've got specialists that you can contact. So this is happening, what do I do? Again, Army, all of those family federations, again, they've got magazines they're producing. They've got like all those things. And they're always free to all the spouses of family members. So people can just like register, and then every month or every quarter, they'll get a magazine which comes, which has lots of information about loads of different things. So quite often within that, there'll be information on domestic abuse, but because there's so much else as well, it's not so obvious if someone's looking at information.
Yes, I mean, I remember I have had a couple of experiences where when I was had my younger children, and I was in Cheshire at the time. And they had pop-up kind of children's events, and one of them used to be once a month, and it was in the barracks. Although when I first went there, I was like, maybe I'm not meant to be here because I'm not a part of the barracks. But people would actually come in, so you'd have that kind of feel, and there was the same children sort of support workers or family support workers that you would see in children's centre sort of go over to there. And I think it was probably the first time that I'd sort of thought about the barracks and what that means for families and that sort of help and support. So I suppose maybe family events like that will help, like play groups and things. So I'm assuming that's probably a part of maybe the messages to get through and to raise awareness in that way as well. But I can imagine it's quite difficult, and there are a lot of extra barriers to sort of overcome with it, from what I'm thinking about and how I would maybe try and put myself in the shoes. So, what is the percent of the number of people involved in the armed forces who self-refer to seek support, especially where they're based in remote or overseas areas?
So I haven't actually got that data, and it would be quite difficult to get because obviously people can refer to all those different people. So they could refer to a unit welfare officer, they could go to the chain of command, they could go to their commanding officer, they could go to the independent services, they could go civilian. So it's very, very difficult to know. King's College London have been doing some research because until recently we hadn't really got much data on, you know, what the extent was of domestic abuse in the armed forces, etc. So they have been kind of trying to really drill down into, you know, what can we find out, what do you know, what is help seeking like, you know, what are the percentages, is it the same as a civilian society, or are there any differences, any nuances? But unfortunately that information, that data isn't ready yet for publication, but it will be coming in due course. I mean, we've kind of always worked on the basis that actually, you know, people are recruited from all societies, so the prevalence is likely to be very similar to what it is in the wider population. So 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. We're looking at large numbers. You've got a large employer, you know, you've got a lot of people involved in this military. So it's likely the percentages are likely to be very similar. Also, when you think about reported domestic abuse, we tend to have quite a lot in the kind of 16 to 24 to 35 age groups, anyway. And when you think, again, that's a key age because obviously people in the armed forces tend to be younger in that age group. So, so it's difficult really statistic wise, but it would be, you know, it's going to be on the similar lines to the civilian population, but there's likely to be a few nuances because obviously it's very different living in sort of a bubble if you're within a barracks. So all your friends are Army or Navy, RAF. Do you know what I mean? Everyone's the same. You kind of move around as a group. So your key friends, you might have moved away from your home. All these kind of things are going to make it a little bit more difficult for people to access or feel that they can speak out about what's happening. Because there's going to be a lot more consequences, really.
Would there be a time when somebody might, you know, see the signs, the red flags, you know, that we all talk about and go, there's something happening there, or that woman has changed behaviour, those children have changed their behaviour, or they can sense some things happening? Would there be a time where somebody would intervene or try and reach out to that family?
Absolutely. All of those kind of agencies, so unit welfare officers, they're going to be keeping an eye on the families, touching base with people regularly. Again, those specialist services, they're there as well. Chain of command might recognise something's happening, perhaps someone's performance changes. So there's lots and lots of opportunities if people spot the signs. But obviously, as with all domestic abuse, a lot of it behind closed doors, there's a lot of efforts made to cover up what's happening. And you can imagine for a service spouse, you know, it's quite a big decision really to speak out in a way. And obviously we really want them to do that, particularly accessing the confidential support so they can find out what their options are, kind of explore the issues further. But obviously, you know, people will be concerned. They'll think, what happens if I say something? If you're living in military accommodation, what happens with that is a really big concern. A lot of the children might be in boarding school, for example, the military pays for. People have concerns about that. You know, what am I going to do? What happens? What if? What about promotion? And also, if people are going to be posted away, sometimes people think, oh, well, I'll wait till, you know, I've only got to manage another week, then they'll be gone. And then I've got so much break or whatever. And then obviously you kind of think, oh, while the person's away, perhaps they've changed. It'll be fine, or lovey-dovey, come back, and then actually those underlying pressures might still be there. But yes, absolutely, if somebody picks up, you know, if someone recognises that, you know, there's a concern, they think there might be domestic abuse, then absolutely all the policies and everything are there saying, yes, you know, it won't be sort of overlooked. We're not going to, you know, not do anything if someone tells us something. So it's very much kind of proactive. But that obviously can only happen if somebody spotted something's wrong and needs help.
Yes. Well, I'm just thinking from memory here, and thinking, is it right, or are there some differences that if you're married to somebody that is in service, that they don't have to go away as less, or they can move into the barracks or something? Is there a different? I think I can't remember if it was my friend. She had to get married for a reason. But then she ended up in an abusive relationship, but that brought her support or extra perks. I don't know if that's correct. I mean, I don't know how to word it, so apologies on that.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's always been really that if you want to have a military family house, you need to be married.
Right.
Obviously, you've got to demonstrate that, that real sort of family bond sort of thing in place. So it's always been that unless you're married, the spouse, the partner can't go with the serving person. So if they're posted abroad, for example, and you're not married, wouldn't be able to go with them, that sort of thing.
Right, I see.
That is sort of changing now. So they're looking at, with the future accommodation model, they're kind of looking at people in long-term relationships and different sort of models for accommodation. But definitely sort of into the recent past, it's very much has been a big factor. So if you're going out with somebody and you live in Scotland and they're based down in the south of the country, then obviously there is quite a big kind of pull to get married, to be together. Yeah. And then you've got someone who perhaps, your relationship's going to be a long distance relationship potentially for a while anyway. Then you get married, then you move to a totally different part of the country or world. You're away from your family, to your friends. You can become really isolated. And then if you're with somebody who's very controlling, quite abusive, you're in that kind of isolated bubble, and you might not have that, that knowledge of who's around you, who can help you. So you can see how it becomes difficult for people. Your friend, for example, once she's in the service family accommodation, then if the status changes, if they separate, then there's a set time, there's 93 days that a person can stay in the accommodation before they need to have alternative accommodation. And again, so it's quite big. If you trigger that 93 days, then you get that notice to leave the accommodation. You've got to find somewhere else to go. You might have children. Now, there's support. I mean, there is support, and the services are really flexible with that. But obviously, for a lot of people, they kind of think about that 93. Do I want to trigger that? What's going to happen? And as I say, like if they get stuck after that 93 days, the support can be put in place. There's different options. They might have to pay commercial rent, for example. But it is a larger decision potentially than if you're not sort of within that sort of that service family setup.
Yeah, I can imagine it being quite difficult, especially if and I was thinking about, the marriage implication, obviously, to sort of get a home in the barracks, then that you're going to see maybe younger people getting married because of that factor, because of that job role, and then maybe that not being the right decision, that's a forced decision, and that always being at the back of the mind. So not only just for, abusive relationships or potential abusive relationships, but for normal relationships as well. So what is being done to make sure that those affected by domestic abuse have a smoother housing process when leaving the armed forces? So someone's obviously put this, obviously knows this, I think they work with you. They said it's a stressful situation regarding the 93-day notice, you said, and bailiff threat on top of the leaving a traumatic situation. So to sum it up, what's that smoother process looking like when leaving the armed forces? It's, especially in that situation then.
Yeah. So, I mean, the specialist services do everything they can to make it as smooth as possible, but it is quite difficult because obviously the councils have a duty to house people who are homeless, but people can't present as homeless until they've got that notice.
Right.
So almost it kind of, even if it was like a civilian relationship, and if you were living in a house and you have to leave because of domestic abuse, again, there's similar sort of pressures. It's always going to be quite abrupt. So you can try your best to kind of smooth it, but it's never going to be that easy because everyone's like kind of duties. And obviously, like once someone presents as homeless, then yes, a solution has to be found for that. But in the 93 days, obviously, they work really, really hard to try and find a different solution. So if there's domestic abuse, you can present in any area in the country, and as long as you explain that there's domestic abuse, that's why you need to leave the household, you then get priority with housing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not always a good, a fabulous solution, because there aren't like loads and loads of council, or housing association properties that you can just slide into and be your forever home sort of thing. But there is a lot of support given. Obviously, as soon as somebody knows that the 93 days is going to come, or as part of perhaps their planning, so if you're living with an abusive relationship but you're not ready to leave quite yet, you can then go and find out what the options are. So you can then find, and you can kind of think ahead, what happens, how can I do that? And at the end of the day, if someone's in an emergency situation, they can always access refuge accommodation.
Right, okay.
In addition to the refuges that are set up across the country, there are also some military-specific stepping stones, it's called. So some military-specific accommodation, emergency accommodation that people can access. And there are some spaces as well within that for people with no recourse to public funding. Because although we've been talking primarily about people who are UK citizens to start with, we have to remember we've got quite a lot of foreign Commonwealth families as well. So the spouses come with them and this domestic abuse, they haven't automatically got recourse to public funding, and therefore an ability for the councils or the local authorities to then be paying for the accommodation. But again, there's kind of, within the armed forces, there is, they have kind of looked at each of these scenarios.
Yes.
How can we support as best possible? But it is always going to be difficult. Whenever you move house, it's going to be difficult. And when you're leaving an abusive relationship, it's not going to be, right, I'm going to go tomorrow, 5 days time, and will you help me pack? And do you know what I mean? But I mean, there are options, because sometimes within the armed forces, if this is the case, it might be, excuse me, the service person potentially could be sent on a training course or something to give the victim a bit of time to actually sort out to get out of the house, or it could be they could be housed within the barracks. So again, putting that bit of barrier, that bit of time in place for the person, but it's very individual based. For some people, it's never going to be safe for them to kind of let someone know that they're preparing to leave or actually going. So there's always going to be difficult times. But I say, as long as people kind of go, speak as early as they can to the housing department of their council, that the area that they want to move to, speak to them, explain what's happening, and they will always help them. And also, as I say, the specialist support services within the armed forces will also help.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there is so much that I had never even considered or thought about, but it sounds like there is a lot in place, and just like everywhere else, it's that awareness of that support and that service available to somebody going through that situation. So you've covered so much. I feel like I've learned so much just in that space of half an hour talking with you, and just really want to thank you, because it's really opened my eyes to putting myself in that situation, or thinking about what support is available for somebody in that situation, and hopefully the lady who had requested this to come to life, this episode, will hopefully answer those questions. So thank you so much, Karen, for giving up your time. If people wanted to get in touch with what organisation was it that you worked with?
So I'm the Domestic Abuse Forum, but I would suggest the first point of contact I would suggest is the mod.gov.uk Armed Forces website on domestic abuse. Within that, we've got sections, so it's individual services, and you can click on that, and then it tells you where all the support is worldwide or within the UK. There's also case studies about the type of help that's being provided for people. And on the website as well, we've got a practitioner's handbook, and within that, we've really tried to demystify everything. So we've set out really clearly what's the difference between a unit welfare officer and an army welfare service. The one being part of the chain of command, the other one being totally independent and confidential. So we've really tried to set that out. We've also kind of put about the 93 days. We've tried to cover all the things that might be things people are worried about. So within that practitioner's handbook, even if you're a victim, a spouse, that hopefully that answers a lot of the questions, sort of demystifies everything. We've also got information on the families federations. So trying to, within that website, pull everything together. But if there's information that you think actually a lot of people need. If we miss something, then please get in touch. That'd be brilliant, because we're always trying to evolve the website, make sure it's as useful as possible, because we don't want
that's great.
people to be able to get the help if they need it, as and when they need it.
No, definitely. Thank you so much. And what I will do is I'll pop the links that you've mentioned in the description, so people can just click through, really nice and easy. So if you pop to the description, everything will be there for you. If you feel like you need to have a look, or out of interest or for help and support, then please do that. Well, thank you, Karen, so much for that. What we're going to do is we're going to head over to Twitter and actually carry on the conversation about this over there, because it's clearly something we should shed some light on. So for those of you who don't know, the Twitter chat is under #AbuseTalk, and we go live every Wednesday 8 till 9 p.m, and that's UK time, and we discuss something different each week. So we're going to carry on the discussion to do with military and living in barracks over there, and linked to domestic abuse. So if you're free and if you're able, you can pop over there and we'll chat over there as well. So thank you so much, Karen, for giving your knowledge and your insight and that valuable information to us today.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I know that within the armed forces they're really keen. They want people to know the help's there. They want people to access that. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you.